The United States is just a more volatile and polarized actor in the world, which means that our allies and our adversaries can't expect us to be reliable and credible in the way they might have once thought that we were.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. And I'm joined in my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, back from the Cape, I see.
Back from the Cape, I was not eaten by a great white shark. Even more importantly, neither were my grandchildren, which was good because I do love them. No poison ivy, and if we imbibed any of the brain-eating amoebas that apparently exist in some of the ponds on Cape Cod, I think I've survived them.
Excellent. So, as per normal, we start out each episode of Shield of the Republic with the jackassery of the week from the Trump administration and associates. And I'm going to start with the Secretary of Defense and the really cringeworthy video he did on the river entrance lawn of the Pentagon celebrating America's drone dominance. I mean, sadly, it actually covers a memo that he did, which has some valid points and useful instructions for the department about drones. But the video itself just was the mark of a non-serious Secretary of Defense. But he's not really my target. My target really is the member of the United States Senate who put him over the top by voting for his confirmation, who came to the conclusion this week that Pete Hegseth is over his head and not qualified to be Secretary of Defense. Who could have imagined that?
Yeah. I would just supplement that, if I could, Eric, with a ukase from the Secretary of Defense that none of the senior military people who usually go to the Aspen Security Forum can go. Now, I don't go to it because I basically don't find those talk fests particularly useful. But the idea that this is some kind of woke conspiracy, I mean, after all, it's partly organized by my former boss, that well-known communist Condoleezza Rice. This is just ridiculous. This is just childish. And, it is of a piece, actually, with the stupid video. It's teenage kind of stuff. And again, it just makes you worry about what would happen if we ever got into a really serious situation where you'd need thoughtful adult leadership, which I don't think is what we've got in the person of the secretary. But let's leave that depressing subject. And why don't you introduce our two wonderful guests?
Well, I'm delighted to introduce our guests. They are the co-authors of a very important article that appears in the current issue of Foreign Affairs magazine. It's entitled "Absent at the Creation: American Strategy and the Delusion of a Post-Trump Restoration." And its co-authors are Rebecca Lissner and Mira Rapp-Hooper. Rebecca is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations for Foreign Policy, but she was Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris in the Biden administration, and before that, Acting Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the NSC. As a former OVP denizen myself, I feel kind of bond of colleagueship there. She's the author of Wars of Revelation, a book about the impact of military intervention on grand strategy. And the other co-author is Mira Rapp-Hooper, partner at the Asia Group, former senior director for East Asia at the NSC in the Biden administration. And together, they are the authors of An Open World: How America Can Win the Contest for 21st Century Order, in addition to the current Foreign Affairs article. That book was published in 2021. Rebecca and Mira, welcome to Shield of the Republic.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be with you.
You guys wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in 2019 in which you argued that it was possible in the midst of the first Trump term to imagine a restoration of the liberal international order. You then got a chance to work on that with the work you did in the Biden administration. Now, 6 years later, you're coming back with an article with a very different point of view. What led you to change your minds about the viability of restoring the liberal order, its resilience? And for our listeners and viewers, just take as much time as you need kind of spelling out the arguments in the article. Let me start, Rebecca, with you, if that's okay.
Sure, of course. Well, thanks again for having us. And as you said, in the last Trump administration, Mira and I wrote a book about the future of American leadership and the future of the international order. And in that work, we laid out a vision that we called the open world. It was a set of principles for how the United States could actually renovate its grand strategy and approach to international order, but do so in a way that was responsive to some long-term trends, changes in the global distribution of power, rapid technological change, and also, frankly, growing partisan polarization within the United States. And so I would say that what we were trying to do in the last Trump administration was come up with a vision for American leadership that remained globally engaged, but also accounted for some of these long-term trends that we saw as transforming the world in which the US was operating. But even having laid that out, when we both got to the White House in January of 2021 and then watched as President Biden led in the first 6 months or so of US foreign policy in the Biden administration, I would say we were both surprised at the extent to which President Biden was able to take back up the mantle of American leadership on the global stage. You'll remember that early trip to Europe that he took, and he said, "America is back." And to a point that really surprised both of us, coming on the heels of the first Trump administration, the world largely believed us. And we had allies and partners that doubled down alongside the Biden administration. President Biden was able to lead really strong global reactions to Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, to build a strong counter-China coalition. Mira had a huge amount to do with that in the creation of our Indo-Pacific strategy. But the bottom line is this time is different. And our argument in the foreign affairs piece is this time there really is no going back to foreign policy business as usual after this Trump presidency. And I would just highlight quickly 3 reasons why we think that's the case. The first is that in the first Trump administration, he seemed like an aberration. It seemed like Trump had gotten elected. There were various ideas about how it had been able to happen. And for a good chunk of the Biden presidency, there appeared to be a resurgence of bipartisanship. You saw major legislation moving through Congress, the bipartisan infrastructure law, CHIPS and Science, IRA, and so on. And so it really seemed like we'd moved past Trumpism. But from the perspective of today, we know that Trump was not the aberration, but rather Biden was the interregnum in between 2 Trump terms. And what that means for our foreign policy is that the United States is just a more volatile and polarized actor in the world, which means that our allies and our adversaries can't expect us to be reliable and credible in the way they might have once thought that we were. A second reason why this Trump term is different is because he's making much more dramatic changes to American foreign policy much more quickly. And one need only look at the twists and turns of this roller coaster trade war that he's waging to see how much destruction and disruption he has caused in just over 6 months in office. And the third reason is that this Trump administration is also doing really quick damage to the foundations of American power. Democracy and the rule of law at home, our ability to attract world-class talent, funding for scientific research, the dominance of the US dollar and our status as a safe haven for global capital. All of these have come in the crosshairs of the Trump administration really early and will have compounding effects over time on America's global power and competitiveness.
But if I could ask a question, I mean, it seemed to me that one of the things that was particularly powerful about the article is that you do, I think, appropriately and understandably put a lot of this on Trump. But it seems to me you're also making a structural argument, and you're saying that in many ways Trump is more of an accelerant than a cause. And I think that was one of the things that really struck me about it. I very much agree with it. I mean, I think Trump is some sort of mixture of a cause, a catalyst, and a symptom. And it depends on the issue set that you're looking at. But could you say, either one of you, say a little bit more about what do you think some of the deeper structural issues that are, causing us to be in a in a world where we can't hope for restoration? We've got to think about something new.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to chime in on that, Elliot. And I think you're exactly right. We do see Trump as an accelerant to forces that were well underway before either one of his inaugurations. As we wrote when we were tackling this issue set back during the first Trump administration, we see a change in the international system that's been taking place for a long time. And that is the increasing move towards a more multipolar world in which the United States is no longer uncontested in its dominance. That's obviously something that's been taking place for a long time. A key contributor to that, when we look at that as students of geopolitics, of course, is the rise and enduring strength of China. But there are also other signs that have been with us for many years. I think we could trace this set of patterns back to the global financial crisis, where the United States really appeared to falter in a critical moment, and where Russia and China appear to have learned certain lessons about American staying power during that time period. We know that from a public opinion and political polarization perspective, although there may be some reasonable disagreement with this on this show, that long enduring wars in the Middle East really eroded American public opinion support for America's role abroad in certain key areas. And then we also see trends like rapid technological diffusion and innovation changing the way that power manifests itself in the global stage, making it even harder to calculate who is more powerful at any given time and what domains matter for great power competition. So this is not just a world in which the United States is less dominant than it was. It's a world in which power has been diffusing outward for a long time. The United States and China remain absolutely preeminent, but there are lots of other strong players too. We see an increasingly strong India, a Europe which may more autonomously be able to hold its own weight depending on which domains you're looking at, a Japan that still packs a punch. So this is a system structure that looks fundamentally different than the immediate post-Cold War world, in which the United States was able to manage a global system that had redounded for decades to its peace and prosperity, but also gave the world a lot of benefits.
So let me just ask one follow-on and then hand things back to Eric. I take that point, and I think I sort of agree with it, but I would note things like our percentage of world GDP hasn't changed a whole lot in the last few decades. I mean, our period, the period in which we really did shape much of the world order, although not all of it, as people in Eastern Europe, for example, knew, or China or Russia, was one where, after World War II, we had 50 or 60% of world GDP. We continue to have better demographics than just about any other developed country. We have fabulous natural resources. Still have a very strong, very, very strong military. And as for the things like financial crises, well, there was Nixon closing the gold window and lots of other moments. And as for long wars, well, Vietnam was much more costly for the United States than our engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm trying to understand why. I mean, intuitively, I agree with much of what you're saying, but I'd like to hear from you why exactly this is different from those other moments when American hegemony was kind of called into question. I'll just, to kind of wrap the question, I'd just say I remember vividly when I was an undergraduate reading Raymond Aron's book, The Imperial Republic. And Raymond Aron, obviously this extraordinary French intellectual who loved the United States and knew it quite well, in a book published, I think it was actually published in 1974, says, okay, American hegemony, it's all over, but luckily Europe can kind of manage on its own. Well, that wasn't quite right, as it turned out.
This is a great question, Eliot, and I think it's one that we've wrestled with a lot ourselves. I'll say just a few words and then see what Rebecca would like to add. To be clear, what we're arguing is not that the United States does not remain extremely powerful or is in some form of abject decline. We don't believe either of those things. We believe that the United States remains preeminent, and indeed argued back in 2019 and 2020 that the United States had a moment in the incoming Biden administration to retool its role in the world to really capitalize on those continued strengths so that America could remain preeminent even as these major global forces continued to churn and shift. So we fully appreciate the fact that we have some unmatched advantages that are likely to endure. And indeed, I think we see some signs even during this very volatile first 6 months of the Trump administration that many of those remain true. If you look at the relative health of the American economy as compared to the perturbations that have been thrown into the global trading system, we're looking pretty resilient. But that is still to say that the system itself is changing around us even as we remain very powerful. We are never going to unmake China as a peer competitor, at least not anytime soon. And these other forces that have been unleashed, whether they're rapid technological change or intense political polarization here at home, are also going to be with us and are going to continue to test our power.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's actually core to our argument that the United States is and will remain exceptionally powerful. Now, you could think about the broader structure of the international system where it is more multipolar than it was in the immediate post-Cold War period. And it's also more multipolar than it was during the Cold War. But within that more diffuse power distribution, you have two countries that are clearly more powerful than all of the others. And those are the United States and China. And we know that China is already, by many measures, more powerful than the Soviet Union ever was. And so therein lies the challenge, right? Even if the United States hasn't been in long-term decline, many of our allies and partners in the West have as a demographic and economic fact. And so our team, such as it is, or our historic team, has less relative power than it used to. And so the question of how do you capture and how do you capitalize on all of the United States' enduring strengths in order to remake an international system that still redounds overwhelmingly to our benefit? And then how do you do that in the wake of a Donald Trump presidency that is in many ways attacking the foundations of that strength? That is the core challenge that we take up in the article. And that is why we argue that for the next president to come in and to aim to either, on the one hand, simply reverse everything Trump has done, or on the other hand, to try to restore American foreign policy to some post-Cold War norm or vision, both of those would be mistakes because the demands of the next 25 years are going to be different than the demands of the last 25 years. So we need to seize this moment to actually use the power that we still have to remake a system and to remake an approach to America's role in the world that's fit for purpose for the world of 2025 and 2050 and not for 1945 and 1991.
I want to get to the technological challenges, which you address in the article, which I think is one of the most powerful and persuasive parts of your article, as well as the points you make along the way that the trade war that Trump has unleashed is indicative, in fact, of the lack of a strategy for dealing with China as a peer competitor, and the fact that it's leading our Asian allies to rethink their reliance on the U.S. as the guarantor of international order. But before we do, I want to push you on two things. One is the multipolar nature of the international order that we see emerging. I get the argument that we're not in a unipolar moment anymore. That's for sure. American power has been increasingly contested over the last 20 years. I wouldn't argue, Mira, with your point that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, for a variety of reasons, have drained a lot of popular support away from a vigorous U.S. international role in the world. I don't take issue with that at all. I'm not sure, though, that means the world is multipolar. I mean, if you look at what happened with Iran just, in the last couple of weeks, Russians and Chinese didn't lift a finger to help them during the 12-day war with Israel bombing Iran and the U.S. joining in. I don't think that means, as some people have said, and Eliot and I talked about this last week, that this sort of quartet of troublemakers who are working together more closely, as you guys say in the article, isn't a problem for us. It is. But I do think it throws into relief the kind of difference between the coalition that they have and the kind of alliances and coalitions that we've maintained since 1948, which I think are, to me, an indisputable strategic comparative advantage that we wield vis-a-vis our adversaries. So how multipolar is it really? I don't see a lot of other nations sort of aligning themselves and being ready to, take, serious either economic or military action to help Russia or China in a conflict, either in Ukraine or a putative conflict between China and Taiwan. So that's one question. The other is you say at one point in the article that the next administration will have the closest thing, I think, I'm not going to quote this exactly, but to a grand strategic tabula rasa that anybody's had since 1948. And my question is, how blank a slate is it really? Because one of the other things I found less persuasive than other points in the article was this notion that we can prioritize some allies and not others. This notion that somehow our security commitments are severable, I've often found to be in the real world less easy to actually implement than putting it down on a piece of paper. So I'd be interested in either one of your reactions or both of your reactions to them.
I'm happy to jump in, and then perhaps I'll pass to Rebecca on the grand strategic tabula rasa. So on the question of how multipolar the world really is, your point is, of course, taken that Russia and China did not exactly leap to Iran's aid. I think that was notable around the world. But I think we would actually push back on the idea that Russia hasn't gotten any support for its war in Ukraine. I was the senior director for East Asia when we unfortunately watched as the North Korea-Russia relationship began to form. And North Korea basically contorted its economy and its entire security apparatus to be able to produce munitions for Moscow, to be able to prove its political fealty in what had clearly become a critical relationship. Now, we can poo-poo how valuable North Korea is on the global stage, but it was a significant shift in alignment patterns. Likewise, we've seen significant industrial base support, weapons support from Iran to Russia and from China to Russia
During Russia's
war in Ukraine. So I'm not saying for a minute that I would pick their coalition over theirs. Ours is better any day of the week, and we want it to stay that way. But I do think we see a world in which alignment patterns are changing. And if they were to continue along the same trajectory, you could see that coalition, would they remain one, being much more problematic for U.S. interests around the world in ways that really rival and challenge our power. And that is definitionally multipolarity. Now, again, we're not suggesting this is a picture in which power is evenly diffused. These are balanced or equally powerful poles. It's actually a pretty lopsided picture. But part of what we're assuming as we argue that we're likely to meet a much more multipolar world in 2029 is that the rate of change that we've seen during these last 6 months of the Trump administration more or less continues. Because what's different about this time than the last time is that Russia and China have figured out how to work around a President Trump and where they need to take a step back and where they can press their hand. And you better believe that if you're Xi Jinping, you have been working to take great advantage of this trade war to diminish American influence in Asia, and you'll keep it up for the next 3.5 years. So what we see is a picture in which these incipient forces that do challenge American interests are likely to be able to strengthen their hand based on the cards that we are partially dealing them in this moment, which will make the world fundamentally different than it was when we meet it again in 2029.
I think there's also an important point here about how we think about defining American interests in the world and also what constitutes the balance of power at any particular moment. One of the deeply ingrained habits of American strategic thought in the post-war era has been the notion that we need to prevent a hostile power from dominating militarily the Eurasian landmass. And that has been a guiding light for U.S. grand strategy for decades now. What if, we ask in the article, that is no longer the right way to think about what America's paramount interest is in the world, or at least is not the one that we need to elevate above all others? What if, for example, in a world in which artificial intelligence and the ability to operate in space are critical determinants of economic power, technological power, and military power. And they don't map geographically in the same way that we've become accustomed to. And so when we're thinking about, is the system multipolar, is it unipolar, is it bipolar, I think we also need to reckon with the possibility that, the nature of power has changed in such ways that technology may be even more important than military power in some ways. And the nature of that race with China and with others is really going to be vital. And even if you would take our military over the PLA every single day of the week, it's also the case that they're investing more in EVs and batteries and quantum technology and sensors than we are. And over the long run, it may be that when it comes to really exerting power and influence around the world, having control of the commanding heights of those types of 21st century technologies could prove just as important, if not more important, in terms of determining outcomes in those geographies that we determine to be very important. So we're trying to really inject some fresh thinking into sort of how do we define our interests in the world, how do we define power, and what might flow differently from thinking about some of those foundational questions.
Let me pull the string on that a little bit and then kick it back over to Eliot, Rebecca. So can't both things be true? I mean, can't it be a core U.S. interest that Eurasia not be dominated by a hostile power or a coalition of hostile powers? And at the same time that, these new technologies, AI, quantum computing, microelectronics, nanotechnology, all of these things are absolute, and space, of course, are absolutely crucial to maintaining our position and that of our allies in the world. I mean, I'm not sure I see why one needs to be, elevated over the other.
I didn't mean to say that they were mutually exclusive. I meant to suggest that we need to consider both. And when you're just considering the military balance of power, it might lead you to a certain analysis in terms of the multipolar, bipolar, unipolar structure of the international system. But if you broaden the aperture in how you think about power and influence over the next several decades, that might actually lead you to a different analysis in terms of what that distribution looks like, and also perhaps a different set of overarching foreign policy goals. So yes, both must be taken into account going forward.
So, I mean, I guess I'll press even a little bit more. I guess I can't imagine a circumstance in which we could possibly be indifferent to Russian domination of Europe. I mean, that I think it's not China, admittedly. It's not Asia. It is a big clot of advanced technology, and above all, it's most of the countries that are aligned with us in terms of values. And I'll want to have a discussion about values later on. So I just can't imagine that on the one hand. On the other hand, I would also say, look, during the Cold War, we cared about technology. I mean, Sputnik. All of a sudden we're afraid that we're going to lose the edge in space to Russia, and as all of us know very well, a lot of our advances in computer technology and all that sort of stuff, jet engines, were driven essentially by military research sponsored by the government. I mean, I think part of what the case here is that there is need for strong government investment in critical technologies, which is, that strikes me as actually one of the Trump administration's biggest departures. It's, seeming not to think that that's important. I think it's actually more of a departure in some ways than our relationship with Europe, which has always been a lot scratchier than people think. I mean, as long as I've got the floor, let me then try to turn an observation into a question. You suggest, but in a kind of a careful way and in a thoughtful way, but I'm still not sure I agree with it, but it's done thoughtfully, that the values dimension of American foreign policy has to be lessened or modified. I mean, you'll correct me if I'm not quite stating the argument properly. And it seems to me that American foreign policy is always this kind of combination of interests and values. We wrestle with it. We always have wrestled with it, really in some ways back to the founding of the Republic. And thus it ever was, and probably thus it ever will be. And I know, I don't think either of you can believe in the caricature of, people going out crusading to democratize the world. But where exactly do you think what kind of role do you think values should be playing in the shaping of American foreign policy?
Well, let me, first of all, lest anyone think that, what we're arguing is that we should, let Europe fall to Russia. I mean, that's absolutely not the argument. I think how I might put it is in terms of like necessity and sufficiency. In the Cold War, preventing Russia from dominating the Eurasian landmass really was the totality of the game, right? And everything else was basically in service of that. Today, that is certainly one of America's strategic objectives. But if that's all we do, it will not be enough, because today we also have to worry about China, and a China that, to your point about R&D, is outspending us in almost every critical category of technology that will form the backbone of the future of the economy and also the future of much of the developing world. And so, yes, we need to work with Europeans in order to deter and constrain the Russians, absolutely, but we need to do a lot more than that too. And so our argument is about widening the aperture. It's not about rejecting some of these strategic assumptions and goals that have come before, but also accepting that to keep up with the changing world and to marshal the power that we still have as the United States, which, as discussed, remains immense, we need to think much more expansively and in a more novel way about what that has to look like. So that's what I would say about the sort of Eurasian landmass question. But on the values question, I mean, if you look at the post-Cold War trajectory of U.S. foreign policy, democracy has, but for in the Trump years, always been central in some way, shape, or form, right? Bill Clinton came in amidst the fall of the Soviet Union, and he was focused on democratic enlargement. I don't need to tell you all about the George W. Bush administration and the democracy promotion. That was a really guiding principle for that presidency. Obama, too, talked about democracy promotion, and obviously the response to the Arab Spring was a key part of his presidency and foreign policy legacy. And then you sort of had this Trump aberration, interregnum, whatever. And then you had President Biden, who, had a very sophisticated, multifaceted foreign policy, but he was himself quite seized with this idea that we were in a battle between democracy and autocracy as two competing systems of government. So this idea of democracy has been a critical part of American foreign policy for years. And I'll say, my view is, of course, some measure of idealism is in our DNA as Americans. And so that will always have to be part of the cocktail of both interests and values that inform what we set out to do in the world and whom we seek to partner with. However, we also need to be clear-eyed about what it will mean for the next president to follow on this Trump presidency and how the world now sees us having elected Donald Trump twice, and whatever he's done over the last 6 months, whatever he's liable to do over the next 3.5 years. And so the idea that the United States of America can retain the same moral authority on the heels of a presidency that has engaged in conspicuous corruption domestically, dismantled our anti-corruption policy around the world, undermined due process and rule of law within the United States, supported far-right parties and enabled dictators around the world. The idea that we can then sort of take up that same mantle as promoters of democracy and exemplars of democracy around the world, I think is going to be at odds with how the world sees us. And so what we're calling for is a certain humility on the heels of this Trump presidency as we think about the appropriate role for values in American foreign policy going forward. And in particular, for our ability and the extent to which we should tell other countries how to govern themselves. So we can choose to have a foreign policy that is guided by values and that aligns with countries that share our values, but that's different than telling other countries that, if they don't do X, Y, Z, we will put these sanctions on them in order to root out corruption in their countries, when we will be recovering from a presidency that has engaged in pretty egregious corruption within our own country.
Okay, let me ask a follow-up. Would you restore the funding of Voice of America?
Yes, for me, I think that's a critical strategic tool, not just because of a values argument, although certainly there is one, but because it is an important way to get information and engage in.
Yeah, but I also I mean, I think we'd agree that the big difference between Voice of America and RT and the different stuff that the Chinese do is that it is somewhat values informed, starting with truth and honest reporting, including honest reporting about the United States. So, and I don't think, I think there is a danger in being so humble that you forget to make, you don't end up making the case that you need to make to other parts of the world. I mean, it's, you know, we've been there before in a way with Nixon. We're there before with Trump. I guess my feeling is just that it's always a very difficult balance, and will always be a difficult balance, and it's going to be a set of prudential judgments, you know, in future administrations. I guess I'll also say, and then turn things back to Eric. The United States has been accused of hypocrisy going back to World War II. I mean, if not before, you know, the Germans made hay over the status of African Americans in World War II, saying, "How dare you say what terrible people we are when you look at, you know, correctly pointing out things that went on in the South and not just in the South." So it's not like I mean, I think we have to be careful not to create a sort of imagined world in which everybody looked up to the United States as a consistent moral voice in the world. I think for most of our history, that's not how people have viewed us, but that may just be my kind of cranky view of it.
I have to point out that, you know, if we'd had more time for the jackassery of the week, you know, 50% tariff on Brazil, a country with whom we have a trade surplus, because the president doesn't like the way, you know, Jair Bolsonaro is being prosecuted by the legal authorities in Brazil, does not strike me as a non-interventionist policy where we're not, as the president said when he went to Saudi Arabia, going to lecture other people about how to run their internal affairs. The having the United States ambassador to Israel lecture Israelis about, you know, whether they should or not have their government change because it's inconvenient to U.S. foreign policy does not strike me as being non-interventionist. The values that Trump, unfortunately, you know, is inculcating in U.S. foreign policy are illiberal values and sympathy with illiberal parties around the world, whether it's the vice president endorsing AfD in Germany or complaining about Marine Le Pen being investigated for financial fraud by the tax authorities in France. I mean, so there's a lot of hypocrisy to go around here if we're in the hypocrisy business. I want to turn to something where I you know, violently agree with you guys, which is the challenge of emerging technology for, you know, national security policy and strategy. The Trump administration has put an end essentially to the small yard, high fence policy that the Biden administration had in place for restricting small diameter nanochips from going to China. You guys point out that means China is going to be much more competitive in things like AI. You highlight the cuts to research and the assault on higher education. You might have added visa policy, all of which is undermining U.S. competitiveness and innovation in the long run. And you have a great phrase, which is that this is going to impose compounding geopolitical costs on the United States over time. And you talk about you know, the role of technology policy and grand strategy. To sort of spell out a little bit more for us, you know, how, I mean, it's one thing to say we got to take it into account. It's another thing to say, okay, well, how do you actually, you know, kind of, you know, embody this in your grand strategy? I mean, Rebecca and Mira, I'll let you both take turns taking a swhack at that.
Sure. Well, look, I think as you say, Eric, the split screen between the Biden administration and the Trump administration is actually pretty stark on this one. There were some ways in which, as we write in our article, the Biden administration felt like a return to foreign policy business as usual. But one of them was not our technology policy, where we were actually quite forward-leaning and really put in place a very rigorous set of policies that was designed to protect and extend American and allied advantages on technologies like semiconductors and position us to be highly competitive and hopefully win the AI race, right? Those were explicit objectives of our policy. And we did that obviously through domestic legislation like the CHIPS Act. We did that through really rigorous export control restrictions, and that all required an incredibly comprehensive overseas effort to lash us up with the critical allies like Japan and the Netherlands and others who were key to semiconductor production. So you actually saw big pieces of our policy move around critical and emerging technologies and reposition that really centrally in a lot of our alliance policy, as well as domestically. And as the senior director for East Asia, I was in the room for some very tough conversations on these issues, because even allies who deeply agree with the objectives and want to protect and extend our advantages, nonetheless really feel the burn when you ask them to take the steps that are necessary to restrict Chinese access to chips.
So not selling certain kinds of high-end industrial equipment to manufacture chips. For instance, some of our European allies were selling to China.
Exactly. And asking our ROK and Japan colleagues to be extremely vigilant to ensure that their companies are not backfilling ours and selling to China. Tough conversations. And again, we always got there, but it wasn't easy. That part of Trump administration policy seems to really have wilted. And it's possible that some energy will come back. But certainly when I talk to our allies, I do not hear nearly the same focus on enforcing export control restrictions. And indeed, we've seen some winding back of rules like the AI diffusion rule, which seem to operate on a totally different theory of the case and how you compete in technology policy. So whereas the Biden administration was trying to protect and extend an American and allied advantage, the Trump administration seems to be arguing that actually by the diffusion of American technology, we can better compete with China, particularly if countries like in the Gulf adopt our technologies first. So what you have here, again, is really a split screen of two different ways of thinking about how technology should center on competition with, in my own belief, the Biden administration's being a very coherent, not always enjoyable for those involved, but well-crafted and rigorous cut at that policy. And the other side of the screen we're seeing now potentially giving China the door to much greater advantage.
I of course agree with everything Mira said. I think the thing I would add in terms of how we think about technology going forward comes back to this idea of what our alliances are good for over the coming decades. And obviously the core mutual defense security relationships that we have with our allies are incredibly important. But there is really an opportunity that we highlight in the piece to broaden the aperture of our alliance relationships to move more into economic and technological spaces where we have the ability to cooperate and collaborate in ways that redound to our collective benefit and put us in a better position to compete with China. And so as we're thinking about how we can further modernize our alliance partnerships, particularly in a post-Trump world, we should be thinking about how we can harmonize our AI and data policies. We should be thinking about how we can work together on defense co-production of the most advanced technologies. We should be thinking about how we can harmonize our tax policies and our clean energy industrial policies. And all of these will make our alliance relationships stronger. It will diversify them away from just being security relationships. And I think it will also put us in a better position as policymakers to make the case to the American people that these alliance relationships really are working for them. Because it's not just, as Trump would claim, about us providing security guarantees to these free riding allies in Europe or Asia but rather that these are partners that we have that are advancing the security and prosperity of the United States through tangible forms of cooperation that are actually generating good jobs and investments here in the United States. So that process of transformation and further evolution of our alliance relationships, both on the sort of protect side that Mira talked about, but also on the promote side, is going to be critically important going forward.
You asked a very good question about how do you actually center that in a grand strategy. So I'll give you an example of a way where we did it well, although it might have not been all that obvious, but that it was just a first step. And that if we were doing this really seriously, we would go bigger and much better in the future. In 2023, the President Biden announced a comprehensive strategic partnership with Vietnam. This was a really big deal because it was a double upgrade in our relationship with Vietnam under the partnership nomenclature that they use in their system. And it vaulted us to the same level as Russia and China. And that was the Vietnamese way of showing that they wanted to align much more closely with the United States, which from the perspective of Asia strategy is a huge deal, right? If you want to be competitive in Southeast Asia, you want to have Vietnam on your side. One of the key reasons why the government of Vietnam was excited to work more closely with the United States was because through the CHIPS Act, we had an international fund administered by the State Department that could make investments in allied semiconductor supply chains to support the diversification of semiconductor ecosystems away from the PRC. And one of the key deliverables that we announced with Vietnam was a grant from that fund to help support their semiconductor ecosystem. What we were showing the Vietnamese was not just that our vision for their role in Asia was the same as theirs, but that we actually had a toolkit to help them move up the value chain and embody this part of the supply chain that we wanted to route outside of the PRC. It was good technology policy and it was good partnership policy. And at that moment in time, it actually really worked. Now, what's not going to work is Vietnam being subject to a 20% tariff if you want Vietnam to be a part of your semiconductor ecosystem. But with more funds thoughtfully disposed of, when they are disposed of in line with our broader strategy, you can actually do a great deal to bring the rest of the world into a technology policy that also works for the United States.
That's a great example, Mira. The one thing I would say, Rebecca, about some of what you said and some of what's in the article is I'm all about co-production and, relaxing defense trade controls. I think AUKUS was one of the really brilliant steps, if not perfectly executed with our French friends, but that the Biden administration took. But when you start talking about harmonizing tax policies, EV standards and things like that, I just think about it's going to take about 30 years of negotiations with allies to sort of get there. And I just put that down as a, observation that I think, some of this is pretty easy, because not easy, but our allies, both in Asia and in Europe, I think have gotten the message that they need to spend more on defense. And that's, frankly, Trump gets some credit for that, but so do you guys from the Biden administration. We're now maybe over egging the omelet a little bit by moving the goalposts on the Japanese and others, but I think they get it intuitively. On some of this other stuff, you're really trying to align politics, not just in our country, which is deeply polarized, but European and Asian countries that have similar kinds of polarities on these issues. I just wonder how practical it is as a matter of strategy.
Absolutely, Arkin. It's not going to happen overnight. I think my answer to that question is you start small with the countries with which you're most closely aligned. You try to do proof of concept and you build on that over time. So it's certainly not the case that in a matter of 1 year or even multiple years, you're going to have a full-fledged kind of allied ecosystem where we're able to harmonize across all of these dimensions. I mean, even just watching the Trump administration's negotiations over the past several months, it's really hard to, as it turns out, negotiate a lot of different trade deals simultaneously. And those aren't even real trade deals. They're just framework agreements. Who knew? But I do think that's where we should be moving towards. And I also think that's how you start to evolve beyond a debate about trade policy and international economic policy that has sort of stalled out. Because when you focus too much on market access as the key metric, even with allies and partners, you're missing out on all these other domains of cooperation, whether that's access to critical minerals, whether that's thinking about, what are we going to do about an EU carbon border tax, that are going to be really important going forward. And so to me, to sell to the American people the idea that we do need to engage in economic exchange with other countries, we need to reframe the argument in a way that captures all the different benefits of this kind of international economic activity and doesn't just feel like we're letting countries dump low-cost goods into our markets and losing American jobs to offshoring.
Fair enough.
We're unfortunately coming close to the end of our time. I want to pick up on something that you said in particular, Rebecca, about the need to explain to the American people what this is all about. And as I reflect on the last 4 or 5 administrations, including the one which Eric and I served, but I would also say the first Trump administration, I would say the Biden and the Obama administrations, presidents did a terrible job of explaining to the American people why we were doing what we were doing and why it was important. I think, and like I said, I would, that indictment covers the George W. Bush administration, but I think it also covers Biden and Obama. And I think that's going to be critical in this more complicated world that you've described. I think accurately, even where there are disagreements about nuance, it's going to be all the more important that we have, that people like us, but more importantly, the political leadership talks to the American people about this is why this is a good idea. The question I wanted to ask you both is, unlike these 2 old former Republican has-beens who host Shield of the Republic, you both have futures. And you have futures in the Democratic Party, and you have futures in the conduct of American foreign policy in a future Democratic administration. I don't have to flatter you, and I'm not flattering you. That's just my assessment. And I'd be really curious to hear where you think the Democratic Party is going, because as much as we see, various fractures within the Trump coalition between people who are isolationists, people who are somewhat more traditional internationalists, protectionists, free traders, all that sort of stuff, there are also divisions in the Democratic Party, which historically actually has tended to be less unified and less disciplined. So could the two of you talk about that? And, since you will have a role in trying to steer it, that's actually, I would hope, part of the purpose of this article. What are some of the lessons you want to convey to your fellow Democrats and to a future administration? So can we talk about the future, and particularly the future within the Democratic Party?
Sure, I'm happy to start and then can toss it to Mira. I would say that right now, the Democrats are in the challenging position of being a party in opposition and having a president in the White House who is so unpredictable by design and so mercurial that he often contradicts himself and reverses his own policy within the space of days, if not weeks. And so it can be very hard to oppose a president who isn't against opposing himself in some ways. And I do think that if you look at Democrats, particularly in Congress, it has been difficult for them to gain traction in a world in which you have a president who's so erratic and all over the place because you're arguing against something one day and then he does it the next day, and it becomes difficult to really make the case. Now, that being said, there's plenty of fodder for Democrats to oppose, and I do think you're seeing many of them get their sea legs now. But what we would argue, I think, is that there are just necessary limits to reflexively opposing Donald Trump, including the challenges I just described. And so some of it, of course, politically, you're blocking and tackling, and you're making the counter argument, and there are a lot of principled counter arguments to be made. But our view is that over the medium term, it is important for either Democrats or, frankly, more traditional Republicans like yourselves to build a foreign policy platform that's affirmative and isn't just predicated on opposing Donald Trump. Because, there are some things that he will do over the course of the next 3.5 years that will be very hard to reverse. And it may be that the next president would do better to try and build on them rather than to try to take us back to the status quo ante. There are also places in which Donald Trump has just created political space where it might not have existed before. And for those who oppose him to have blinders on and sort of only want to revert to approaches of yore, they could actually miss out on some of that new political space that has been generated by this president. And so for all of those reasons, I would say that the future of the Democratic Party on foreign policy cannot just look like it's past, and also that we would be making a mistake as Democrats if we allowed ourselves to become too consumed over rehashing debates of yore rather than really trying to look ahead to the future and find ways to build an argument to the American people that will resonate with the populace, which, as you said, Eliot, has polled as dissatisfied with America's role in the world almost every single year since 2006.
So again, this is a great question. And because we have to do it as Shields of the Republic lovers, this is when I bring us back to Walter Lippmann. The purpose of American foreign policy has always been to keep Americans safe and to help them to prosper. And we would argue and will advocate for building a foreign policy for what comes next that is still focused on those goals, but is focused on those goals in an updated way that reflects the world that we're going to meet in 2029. Not explaining our commitments in terms of the liberal international order or a set of systems and processes that everyday Americans may not understand or particularly care to understand because they're irrelevant to them, but rather explaining why an ally keeps us safer or why a particular trade or economic policy can actually benefit you and your family sitting at your kitchen table. That's incumbent upon either political party to be able to do better, and it's certainly incumbent on any presidential candidate to be able to do better. But as I think Rebecca is intimating, the space is pretty wide open. You were right, Eric, to suggest that we're not going to have a pure grand strategic tabula rasa 4 years from now, in the sense that there will be a huge number of path dependencies in our relationships, a huge number of conventions that Americans simply can't, don't, or shouldn't shake off, and a huge number of missions that continue to call us into the world, even if they've been deeply shaken by the last 4 years. But it is nonetheless the case that I think at a popular level as well as at an elite level, there is increasingly broad acceptance around the idea that our role in the world is changing. So a skillful politician who takes up this mantle next will have incumbent upon them better than anything else to be a good messenger who can take some of the ideas we've been talking about today and distill them back to the everyday well-being of Americans when they try to explain what our role in the world should be. We hope we'll be doing work over the next 3 years plus to provide some fodder for those types of messages and those types of debates, but we'll hope to have the chance to join you again in the coming years to talk it through further.
Well, we'll be delighted to have you. We could go on, I'm afraid, for quite a bit of time because your article is incredibly provocative, very, very intelligently argued, and absolute essential read for all of our listeners and viewers. You'll be a lot smarter about America's role in the world for reading Absent at the Creation. But we'll have to wrap it up. At Mira Rapp-Hooper and Rebecca Lissner, we hope to have you back again.